Hello and welcome to the 42nd edition of Half Hour, a podcast starring me, John Paulo Giudice, as your host. In today's episode, I will discuss public diplomacy versus propaganda with Eduardo Meñez. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you.
I hope I got the last name right. It's kind of hard, but I also have a hard last name, so I kind of get it.
Yes, well, the way you pronounce your last name is American.
Yeah, it's new pronunciation.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so to begin, if you want to tell the audience a little about yourself, maybe where you were educated, what you're doing here in Prague, this type of information.
Yeah, well, as was mentioned, I'm Eduardo Meñez, the Philippine ambassador to the Republic, the Czech Republic, and I'm a career diplomat. Been with the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs since 1991, so coming up to 32 years. Actually, second generation. So my father was also a diplomat, and so basically, I'm like a lot of the people in the audience, I guess, who may have been brought up in other cultures and now working in a foreign country. So like yourself, you're studying in a foreign country, and basically my life has been exposed to different cultures, working with in different foreign countries, and trying to, of course, improve the bilateral relations between the Philippines and these different foreign countries.
What would you say, really kind of, I know you said you were second generation diplomat, so you say your father was a diplomat as well, or he worked in the diplomatic field. Do you know where was his, I know a lot of the ambassadors I've spoken to already, they usually move around, they might have a job, in the Czech Republic, they might have a job in Japan or in any other countries, and they move around. Where would you say his one of his defining missions was?
When my father was with the Foreign Service, he started in the 50s and he retired in 84. So the diplomatic landscape, as far as the Philippines was concerned, was quite different at that period. In fact, even the length of assignments abroad was not regulated. So in his career, he was actually abroad. The first stretch was, I think, 16 years abroad straight. Then he came back to the Philippines for about 2 or 3 years, and then he went abroad for another 14 years until he retired. So it was a different system during the earlier years. And for the family, that meant that most of my siblings, who are all older than me, I'm the youngest, grew up not really knowing the Filipino culture. And when they returned to the Philippines, there was a bit of a culture shock. Because the first 16 years abroad were in the United States, Italy, Japan, in that order.
Oh, wow, okay.
So they basically grew up in international schools.
Mm-hmm.
And when they came back to the Philippines and, of course, continued their schooling, they did not really fit in with the local schools. So they had to continue their studies in international schools until college, where my 2 eldest siblings entered the state university. But anyway, the educational system in the Philippines is most of the subjects are taught in English.
Okay.
Because, as you probably know, the Philippines was under the United States for about over 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the educational system, the system of government, are based on the U.S. Models.
Okay. I know that one of the large languages there is it Tagalog? Tag?
Yeah, there are over 140 dialects
Okay. All right.
because we are a country, an archipelago of 7,641 islands.
Okay, I see.
So different islands have different cultures, different ethnic tribes, different dialects.
Mm-hmm.
And Tagalog is a dialect, a language from the northern part of the Philippines, and was the most dominant language, and is the official language is Filipino,
Okay, I see.
and Filipino is mostly Tagalog, because the seat of government was most of the time in the northern group of islands called Luzon.
Oh, okay.
The
I
other official language is English.
Mm-hmm.
So there are two official languages.
Is Spanish widely spoken there as well?
It used to be widely spoken because the Philippines was also a colony of Spain
Mm-hmm.
for over 300 years
Yeah.
before the Americans. But unlike America, Spain did not bring the educational system, strictly speaking, and spread it among the local people.
Mm-hmm.
They brought the religion,
Mm-hmm.
and some religious orders opened schools, but I think probably most of the schools that they opened were for the upper classes.
I see.
So I think that the general public, I mean, I think because the schools were also part of the religious conversion
Mm-hmm.
that Spain wanted to do. So I think everyone had to know Spanish the first, the earlier years. But when the Americans came and they brought the educational system, Spanish eventually was displaced. So when I was in college, we still were required 16 units of Spanish, but that was done away with a few years ago.
Oh, okay. And maybe that's, English has kind of replaced it in this way, or maybe it's more domestic, like Philippine
English
Tagalog.
displaced Spanish, as a medium of communication for the Filipinos.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that's actually very interesting. And you said your career, you were here in the Czech Republic. You said you got here somewhat recently. And what missions did you do before this?
My first posting as an officer
Mm-hmm.
was to the Netherlands. So I was 6 years in the Netherlands from 1996 to 2002. And then under the new system, after 6 years abroad, we have to come back to the Philippines.
I see.
Because the framers of the Foreign Service Act said, we can't have our people abroad too long because then they become more acquainted with the culture and the policies of the country they're posted to, and forget that they're Filipinos. So the new law specified 6 years abroad, 2 to 3 years back in the home office. So after the Netherlands, it was back to Manila. Then the next 6 years was Singapore, and then New York,
Okay.
and then back to Manila. And then the next 6 years was to Iran, and then Tokyo, then back to Manila. And now I'm starting my next 6-year tour of duty here in the Czech Republic.
Well, that's a pretty amazing journey. I mean, it sounds like you've been a lot of places in the world already. And what would you say was your main takeaway from like any of those previous missions? Like what was something that you maybe not only remember but you learned from?
Well, we always get asked the question, what was your favorite post? And we always say, I always say at least, each post is memorable, and we try to take away the best, lessons from each post that we've been to. Um, and for, let's say, the Netherlands, it was a good time to be in the Netherlands as a young family. I had my wife and 2 young kids, so Western Europe in the late 90s was pretty good. It was pre-Euro time.
Oh, okay.
So you still had the different currencies.
Mhm.
The Schengen area was already open, so you could drive around Western Europe. On your weekend, you could drive down to Brussels, to Paris. We even actually drove to Prague while we were still in The Hague
Oh, okay.
in the 90s. So, yes, Western Europe, Netherlands was an excellent place to raise a young family,
Hmm.
see Europe, Western Europe. Then Singapore, it's a modern city-state.
Mhm.
I was detailed to the APEC Secretariat, so I also had a lot of travels around the Asia-Pacific Economic Community area. And it's, of course, a totally different culture,
Mhm.
modern yet Asian. And of course, the trips to the other parts of the APEC economies was quite interesting. New York was the center of multilateral work, and the work at the United Nations is very interesting.
Mm.
I think every diplomat should have at least one posting to a multilateral post. This might be something that you might be doing when you graduate from your international relations degree. And in the UN, the work is very interesting. You get to meet the diplomats from the other 192 UN member states. And, well, some people don't like multilateral work in the UN, in New York in particular, because of all the language negotiations when you have to come up with a resolution that will be presented before the UN General Assembly. But it was work that I enjoyed, negotiating and actually leading the negotiations for particular resolutions. And of course, New York is, the Big Apple,
Mhm.
the city that never sleeps. So again, that experience is something that is something to be remembered.
No, absolutely. There's so much food there too. I mean, there's so much diversity in
Very
food.
multicultural.
Yeah.
A lot of Broadway and other cultural things that you can do.
What was like a resolution that you found to be very like rewarding when you either worked on it or maybe pushed for its passage, or maybe it didn't end up getting passed, but it was something that taught yourself or the others around you who helped work on it,
Right,
like
right.
something.
When I was assigned to New York, I was given second committee work, which is economics, environment, migration
Mhm.
is also covered there.
Mhm.
And I was immediately thrown into the deep end, so to speak, because I had never really handled negotiating a UN resolution before. But, my superiors at the time said, well, the best way to learn is to do it yourself. So they gave me a resolution on globalization
Okay.
that when I was in New York, that was 2007, 2011, was a very hot topic, and it still is.
Mhm.
And of course, when you negotiate or when you are the facilitator of a resolution, you do not represent your country's positions. You are there to manage the discussion of all the interested countries to put the language together and come up with a final agreed resolution. So you begin with a draft, and you conduct meetings to add language, change language, and ultimately come up with an agreed language that will be submitted to the UN General Assembly for adoption. So it was really challenging because, of course, you have different perspectives from different delegations, and sometimes, they argue about commas, they argue about agreed language. So it is, in a way, very esoteric for a multilateral diplomat to know the history of a particular resolution, because this resolution had been running for several years, and that is the history of many resolutions in the United Nations General Assembly is that it comes up every year, and they just add new language or they add a new paragraph. So for globalization, it had been running for a number of years, and I was tasked to update the resolution. And I think I did it maybe 2 or 3 consecutive years.
Okay. So the specifics really matter with something like that. Like when it comes to like agreeing on exactly what language you want to use in the resolution and things of this nature.
Right. Because when you use the term agreed language in the UN, it means that this particular phrase has a history. And the history could be, one country objected to a comma in the middle, or the use of the, or
it can be very much a process, to make sure everyone can agree.
And the agreed language, if you attempt to change something, then the people who were there before and know the history will say, no, we've had this discussion. You can't, you
can't put it in there.
Right. So, yeah.
So does this have, some context with the public diplomacy versus the propaganda, in the sense that, one state or one delegation may feel as though, if this is included, you are kind of subsetting our interests, and it could even be seen as like propaganda in a very extreme sense. But what are your thoughts on that when we talk about how, when you say public diplomacy as well, I'm thinking of more regular everyday people kind of being involved in the process in some fashion. But I was curious to get your thoughts on that as well. Right.
Well, you're correct with your initial understanding of the term public diplomacy. But with regard to your question, when it comes to negotiating language in a UN resolution, the people who are assigned to negotiate this particular resolution have their country interests in mind. And they are also aware of possible language that will be proposed by other countries who would have a particular agenda that they want to introduce into the language, that if passed by the UN General Assembly would sort of, validate their national position, because that particular phrase or word or reference was included in a UN resolution. So people are very careful to guard against the introduction of certain phrases, certain words, certain understandings of a phrase into UN resolutions.
One thing that I can think of, one scenario, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the UN. It's more of an EU type of situation. But in Bulgaria, they are blocking North Macedonia's route to the European Union, based on the fact that they want the language of Macedonia to be recognized as some dialect of Bulgarian, whereas the Macedonian delegation kind of, in the nation as well will claim that it's its own language and
Right.
that it might be akin to,
Mm.
Serbian, Bulgarian, Macedonian, these states they all claim that it's their own.
Right.
Serbo-Croatian, a little different, obviously. I've been told it's more of a dialect by,
Uh-huh.
by speakers of this language,
Yeah.
but that's a good example, I think, of kind of what you're referring to
Right,
in a way.
right, right. Because each delegation will have their national interests, of course,
Hmm.
that they want to protect, or a national objective that they want to project.
Right.
So, as you mentioned, if this particular reference is adopted, then either your national interest is damaged
Mhm.
or is supported, and therefore negotiation is by necessity. We always say in the UN, negotiated language is always, no one is happy with the final outcome.
Yeah.
Because no one gets what they want. It's all negotiated.
Compromise, in this
Yes,
way. Yeah.
yes, subject to compromise. So, as a future diplomat, you would really need to know what your instructions are, how far you can go, what would
Mhm.
be agreeable, etc., etc.
And I was also, we had a presentation in one of my classes, and he worked for this automotive company, and he was talking about how he met with, French, Italian, and German delegations, and each group negotiated differently, or if they're coming to a business arrangement.
Right, right.
The Italians might be out kind of late, sipping on their red wine and things like that, and the Germans are much more willing to get things done quickly.
Right, right.
So there's like a cultural element to this as well. I'm sure that when you're negotiating, especially between countries on different continents, that you're going to find a lot of different cultural aspects that you kind of have to
Yes.
take into account when you're actually discussing. I know as an American, we are very industrious people, and we want to get it done. We have almost like a very Germanic work ethic in our country. And we kind of just, want to get to the point, get business,
Right.
straightened out.
Right.
And in other places, it's not always so direct.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you mentioned a very interesting, it's part of understanding the art of negotiation.
Hmm.
Let's say as a host, or as maybe the facilitator of a resolution or some sort of negotiation, these factors are taken into account. Who are the actors involved? What is their style of negotiation? Sometimes even the setting is a consideration. Would you like it to be in a relaxed setting where maybe people are less uptight, or do you want it in a very business-like setting, or even the shape of the table?
Yeah.
Is it round? Is it rectangular? Are you facing each other? Are you beside each other? These are all factors that go into trying to set the most, conducive conditions
Hmm.
to achieve a successful outcome.
Hmm.
Because, of course, you enter into negotiation with an expectation that you will have a final document, a final resolution, a final statement. And it's to everyone's interest that final outcome is achieved, because it would mean the success of the negotiation process, the success of the host in bringing together these perhaps two opposing sides and successfully come up with a peace treaty or whatever. So, as you said, certain country delegations are known for their style of negotiation.
Yeah.
And as a person who wants to ensure a successful outcome, these are things that you do take into consideration.
Yeah, and I know in the past, negotiation was sometimes even one-sided. It could feel like, I read about a lot of treaties that were signed between
Right.
colonial powers and their subjects, and whether even it could just be kingdoms, even before that,
Right.
in Europe and Asia and Africa, and a lot of the time there was an operation of kind of dominance in this way. Like maybe
Yes.
another state would be like, we're signing this treaty with you because we don't want to annihilate you. Like it's like this group of people so much smaller.
Right.
And at the time it was like that. And I guess that's where the propaganda can come in, right? Because now I'm thinking about how, you had these negotiations back then, and they were always probably thinking about, the shape of the table, the environment, the room that they were in. And it's all kind of like steering it into a mood.
Right.
But of course, propaganda is a much more strong kind of aspect. Like it is a little more involved than just the shape of a table.
Right.
In this way.
Yeah.
What would you say, like, for the audience when we're talking about, public diplomacy versus this propaganda? Like, how do you kind of reconcile the two?
Right. When we speak of public diplomacy as it's understood in the international relations discipline nowadays, basically the elements that you're thinking of would be the government communicating a story, a narrative, with the purpose of achieving an objective to influence the target audience. And of course, when you want to influence a target audience, the objective would be to make them either understand your side better or to change their attitudes towards dealing with your government or your company or whatever. And public diplomacy was coined actually in the United States in 1965, I believe, because of the negative connotations that arose with the term propaganda. And again, for those of you who are international relations students, you will recall that propaganda was used throughout history, usually in the context of wars.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was, I guess, it became more sophisticated and better known in the 20th century with the First and Second World Wars, where propaganda was used by the protagonists to try and convince the other side or the public on the other side that you're on the wrong side of the war, you have you're fighting for the wrong causes, give up, and don't support your government, basically.
Yeah.
Or the propaganda could be directed at your own people, saying, we are fighting the just war.
Like, you need to come help. You
need to come help.
Uncle Sam was a U.S.
Yes. So again, as I said, the term propaganda was given a very negative image, a very negative view by most of the public, because it was used in the war, and everyone said, oh, the other side used propaganda to brainwash their own people, etc., etc. So in 1965, as I said, there was an American academician who came up with the general description of public diplomacy. As I said, the elements of which were using communication to influence the perceptions and the ideas of a target audience. For the United States, it meant because the U.S. has a very particular usage of public diplomacy. it refers to the target audience always refers to the foreign audiences. And when you speak about communication with your domestic audiences, you use public affairs.
Mm-hmm.
But in other countries around the world, the public diplomacy can refer to both communicating with your domestic audience, communicating with foreign audiences.
Ah, I see.
So, but even up to now, people will still argue that, and actually the literature does say propaganda is a type of public diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
It still is a type of public diplomacy.
No, this is true. This is true.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're kind of getting close to the end here. We're a little over, which is okay. But I was hoping, if you want to leave the audience with maybe a minute or two of, kind of like some thoughts to wrap it up.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Right. Well, we're using a podcast to communicate right now, and
Right.
this just goes to show that the information and communication technology revolution has completely changed the way diplomacy is being conducted. Again, based on international relations history, when the telegraph was invented, I think Lord Palmerston, the UK foreign minister, said, diplomacy is dead, or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
And when the internet, was widely promoted and became used by everyone, the information communications technology revolution again has changed the way diplomacy is conducted. And so now practitioners need to be very aware of how public diplomacy can be an effective tool
Mm-hmm.
to achieve your objectives. And you also need to guard against the use of public diplomacy and misinformation and disinformation to try and influence the general public. So, information, the arena of warfare has, I guess, globalized the use of information. And you can see it very clearly in the international relations issues confronting the world today, where, conflicts are also fought through the use of social media.
Oh yeah, online, in the air, in the sea, in space,
And so,
on land.
what is the truth? So I leave that to to your listeners, and so you need to be very aware and be very critical of everything you read and listen to.
All right. Well, I guess take that audience, take that message, and hopefully it resonates with the audience. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Right. Thank you.
Guys, look out for 43, and peace. Cheers.